I met Pat when I was 18 years old, wearing knee socks, I kid you not, preppy days in the 80s, coming down from Dartmouth College to interview him at his home in Virginia. I'd never been to Virginia before, and I drove all the way with Dinesh D'Souza, Keeney Jones, and doing this thing for the Dartmouth Review back then, and I was a freshman, and we drove all the way down and never seen Washington, and I met Buchanan, and it was like, I looked around his house, all his photos of Reagan and Nixon and beautiful book and library, and I thought, wow, people actually live like this. And all these years later, just a few years later, on my last radio show, it's fitting that Pat Buchanan is back. He's the godfather of really modern-day, correct, populist, more nationalist conservatism, and he joins us now. Pat, how you doing, brother Pat?
Doing fine, and thanks for the introduction and calling the memories of Pat and Joan Baez.
Pat, that has to have been, I'm not kidding you, that has to have been like a 2003 or something, 2004, that interview with you. It's a long time ago, obviously. But it's interesting to end this show at a time where the debates that we've been having in the conservative movement all the way, since you started in it in the 60s, all the way to today, it's kind of all come full circle. This news yesterday about the president pulling out of Syria, cheered by so many of us because, what are we doing there? 2,000 troops after ISIS has been destroyed. But the howls from the military-industrial complex, Pat, you could hear them all the way over to McLean from Capitol Hill.
Well, you sure could, and what Trump has done with his jolting decision, apparently against the advice of Pentagon State and Bolton, his war cabinet, if you will, is really set the cat down among the pigeons. He's got the debate going in the nation as to when, if ever, we're going to get out of the Middle East wars, the forever wars in which we were marched by Bush II and by Barack Obama. And he has said we're going to start bringing the troops home from Syria right now. And there's 2,200 or so in there. That's the low figure I've seen. Others have mentioned more. But there's no doubt about it, Laura, that there's going to be consequences from the great American withdrawal from all these interventions around the world. And the fundamental basic point is that the United States is not strong enough and it doesn't have so many vital interests that it can fight, half a dozen forever wars in the Middle East along with containing Russia and containing China. Both of those policies, all of those policies. And so we're going to have to pick and choose. And Trump has ignited a tremendous national debate.
Well, and Adam Kinzinger, who's a Republican congressman, he's a big time interventionist, said this today.
It seems like the president, this bromance with Rand Paul that just got completed somehow. They played golf enough, and Rand, with his very out there foreign policy that's actually libertarian and has nothing to do with republicanism but is masquerading as a Republican, somehow got in the president's ear. And instead of the president going in front of his foreign policy team that actually knows this stuff, he just says, hey, it's done. We're going to do it. We're going to pull everybody out. Rand's excited. Laura Ingram's excited. But the rest of people that actually understand how the world works, the rest of us are pretty confused.
The rest of us who thought we were going to be greeted as liberators in Iraq and would be out in 14 months and trillions of dollars later.
Rest of us who understand how the world works. Now, I don't think Adam Kinzinger was one of them, but that was the elite, the establishment, and the others who marched us into Iraq, and we're going to create a major democracy in the heart of the Middle East. It's going to be a model, who marched us into Libya, who took us into Syria, ignited that war, who tried to build Iowa out there in Afghanistan, and who got us involved in a war for what reason in Yemen, I do not know. But the chickens have all come home to roost for these folks. And the elites that got us into the war, I understand now they realize that Trump is beginning a pullout from these wars, and the consequences are going to be, many of them are unknown, and many of them could be unpleasant. But the United States of America simply cannot sustain the kind of foreign policy they want, where you've allegedly got troops in over 100 countries.
Now, and Pat, they always act like it's 1995 still or something. We're not running these massive deficits where we don't have $20 trillion in debt. Those days are over. We decided to blow all this money in globalization and blow all this money, trillions on these wars. China didn't fire a shot in Afghanistan or Iraq, and they're just just chalking up the cash.
Right.
And
how has China suffered by not having been involved in any of these wars in which we're involved? Nothing. They just ignored this and let the Americans come in and do it all. And the decisions taken, I mean, what has happened is basically you can go all the way back to the late respected Poppy Bush, and the idea that the United States could, after the end of the Cold War, which we had made enormous sacrifices and cost ourselves greatly to win that, we went basically out to remake the entire world in our own image. And we got into one war after another, after another, after another. And Donald Trump is president because he said, we can't afford all this. We got to start looking out for ourselves. And what we got now is the most jolting decision he has made. But he's really going to ignite a national debate on this thing, on how long and how much we should spend to try to protect some of these countries, or try to basically fight every war for all the various countries in the Middle East.
Joe Scarborough today, another former pal of yours, Pat, was also speculating that there may be other motives in this pullout from Syria.
This is foreign policy welfare for Vladimir Putin. He can't even believe his luck. Or, I'm sorry, maybe he can. Maybe this is connected to something that none of us know about.
Well, let me talk to that. Look, Vladimir Putin is backing Assad in Syria. Assad, Iran, Russia, and even Hezbollah, whatever you say about it, they are Shia, basically. And the Al-Qaeda and ISIS detest and despise Shia, and they like killing them more than they like killing us. So the folks who are in control in Damascus now, and those who back them, are the ones who are going to have to deal with the Syrian problem of ISIS after the Americans leave. So I don't think this is of great benefit to Russia, frankly. The very fact that we were battling ISIS and still are, I'm sure for a certain period of time, is of a great benefit to Assad, because we're fighting one of his principal enemies.
Yeah, again, the hatred of Trump, Pat, is so visceral, and it's on the surface everywhere.
Well, I think lately, there's a sense you get of the feeling that there's blood in the water.
Yeah.
You get that in the last couple of weeks, et cetera, with all the different investigations going on in the media every morning, something new and some breaking news. And I agree with you. I mean, there's a detestation. There's an effort not only to break and bring down Trump, but I think to disgrace him and discredit his election as having been illegitimate and stolen, and then basically to put him in jail as some kind of criminal. And it's visceral and it's visible. I mean, you can ask the people. There's real hatred toward the man out there.
Well, and is it Pat? Is it more his tonality? Is it who he is, the way he speaks?
I think it's all of those things and more.
Or is it the policies? In other words, if they successfully drive him out of office, it's not like we're going to go back to the military interventionism of the Bushes. That's never going to work again.
Never coming back, and also
never
in the future, because of what's going on in the border. If you don't stop, I mean, what is clearly an invasion again from the south, from Africa and the Middle East and Latin America, all moving north into the successful countries of the West and expanding their welfare states and really moving in and changing and altering their culture and character and the populations. I think if you don't do that, this is the existential threat to the West. It is not Russia. I mean, in the Kerch Strait building a bridge. That is the great existential threat to the world, I think, the Western world. And there is disagreement with that on the part of the left in this country. There is opposition to all of his policies on in foreign policy of bringing down the American empire, ridding us of all these commitments around the world, stopping these wars. I mean, it threatens and challenges every aspect of what these folks believe ought to be done and what they've been doing. In addition to that, there's the personal thing. They don't like him personally, and the back and forth has gotten to, I mean, it's almost gotten to, back in the days of Andrew Jackson, people would have been out dueling each other the way the talk is going now.
No, and I do think they believe that somehow once Trump's gone, all the problems that they created with this addiction to globalization and to these cheap Chinese goods and to open borders, like that's going to somehow then work. Well, look at what's happening in France. They bought in completely to globalization, and they welcomed all these people there, and they hoped it was going to work out, and they did the climate change stuff, and people are miserable because their standard of living is stalled out or going down. So people will ultimately say no. And then what happens, Pat? Then where do we go?
Well, this is why you can see where we will go by where we are going. If you take nationalism and populism, and even individual leaders and rulers rising up to represent the will of the people when it's not represented by the democratic polity that exists there. The things that create the movements and the issues and the ideas that created Trumpism are still there. People want their secure borders. They want their own country maintained. They don't want to be bled to death for foreign wars. They realize that they're spending more than they're saving, and they're spending themselves into bankruptcy. This is happening all over the Western world, or the United States, and people aren't going to go back to the same old, same old. In the election of 2016, if you take Cruz's vote and Bernie's vote and Trump's vote, the repudiation of the establishment and the elites and what they delivered was massive. That was utter rejection. And the idea that if they overthrow Trump and climb back into the positions of power and get all the titles they used to have, they're going to be beloved and welcome. They are deluding themselves.
Yeah, Pat, and then magically the Weekly Standard will reconstitute itself.
No. Somebody drove a stake through that at the crossroads at midnight.
Well, Pat, I have to say, you're going to come on the podcast, so it's not like I'm not going to talk to you anymore, obviously, but I just want to tell you that I think, other than Reagan, you've had the biggest sort of philosophical influence on me over the years, and with such grace and poise and wisdom, you've really helped so many people. You've helped me personally just frame things properly and kind of come to terms with where I had kind of bought in on the kind of neoconservative jump on the military, we love the military, we love the people of the military, incredible, wonderful, amazing people, but that's different from going all gung-ho in all these foreign wars, and only when absolutely necessary should be doing it. So thank you for doing that.
You've done a great job in your career, Laura, and done a great job on the radio show educating the folks, and congratulations, and I'm sure you're moving on to ever greater heights. And,
well, thank you.
Delighted that we can call you perhaps mildly a protege.
You bet. You bet, Pat. We're all the way back to those knee socks. Pat Buchanan here on The Laura Ingraham Show.